Um, y'all be in prayer for me. I have a really bad ear infection. Um, and it's been painful for me. Um, so I'd just like to continue in this same series we've been doing. That's what I felt led to do this morning. Like I've said in my past videos, I don't really know why. Didn't expect to be putting something like this out on such a public forum, but just trying to be obedient. Um, I guess the thought I want to focus on to start with is the candor of the biblical authors. Um, the candor of the biblical authors. The Bible is actually a book composed in three different languages, mostly Hebrew and Greek, and a couple books in Aramaic. It spans a couple thousand years of history, from when the oldest book is written to when the newest book is written, in first century AD back to about 2000 BC, or later, depending on which scholar you look at. It has around 40 authors, who are separated by language and culture and geography and time. Yet it tells a consistent story, often with allusions to things that are referenced in other books. So that's compelling for me. It would be hard to find a group if they're not being inspired by the direction of the Holy Spirit. They're just writing. Such a varied group across time and geography and culture and language, and just say, go write something, and that it would be so consistent. And that really wasn't the focus this morning, but that's just another thought we might hit on at some point. But the candor of the biblical writers. And what I mean by that, of each author, is not always, but a great percentage of the time, the authors do not portray themselves in a good light. What I mean by that, and it's actually quite refreshing. Can you imagine if you went on, let's say, a first date with someone, or maybe you were trying to hire someone, and this is the first impression you've got of them is at this interview, any of these initial meetings that you might have with someone, and they just very candidly said, look, here are my issues. Here are my faults. Here are the reasons you should doubt what I say. I'm going to get that out front, that I'm a bad person and I've messed up in a lot of ways. And let me tell you the big ones. So, for example, we have, in the Pentateuch, um, references to um, Adam and Eve falling initially. Now, granted, they're not the authors of those books, but it is a people, that the author of that book is tracing his lineage to. So he's talking about his, great 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 grandparents, or however many greats. Says, listen, they messed up. God gave them this very clear demand. Elohim told them in the garden, you are you are definitely not under any circumstances to eat of that tree, and they did. And then, one of their sons murdered the other, just pointing out their faults. And then, Noah, even though he found grace in the eyes of the Lord, he had his own faults as well, his drunkenness and allowing himself to get so drunk. Oh, y'all know that story. That's a little scandalous. We won't get into it, but he allows himself to get more drunk than he should have, and I encourage you to go read that. And then Moses, who's most people agree writing the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, discussing his problems with speech, that he did not want to do this. He had no desire to get involved in this situation and go talk to Pharaoh. That he was in a difficult place, feeling connected to both sides, both the Hebrew people as his ancestors, but being raised in the Egyptian capital by the Pharaoh's family. He didn't want to get involved in this and gave every excuse as to why he should not get involved, even arguing with God himself about that. But eventually he does obey that. Him pointing out how often the children of Israel, even after they've seen all these miraculous things that God has done for them, continue to grumble and doubt and go back and forth in their faith, and say, well, God led us out of Egypt, but then he's led us with you to this desert just to let us die, and those types of things. We move on, we see God promising Abraham a son and a child when Sarah is way, way up in years. I mean, she is elderly at this point, and she doubts that, and Abraham kind of acquiesces. He goes along with her plan. She's like, yeah, God promises us a child, but it can't be from me, in my old age, and sends him one of their staff or maid. Can't remember her exact position, but sends in Hagar, and they have a child together, Ishmael. But God says, no, I promised you and Sarah a child, and I did not mean by that or by some adoption. I meant a literal child. And then they have Isaac, despite their doubts about what God had promised to them. We see Job and his doubts and questioning of God throughout that book. We see David, and I'm going to take a little side track, a little tangent here. That had been a big sticking point. Archaeologists would always say, well, the Bible makes all these bold claims about David being king of Israel, and if he was, we can't find a single reference to him, and etc., etc. The archaeological record is void outside of biblical text. We think he's just fictional, kind of like some people say about Jesus. And we pointed out in that other video that Jesus, outside of biblical writings, has 40 different persons reference him, and he's just a lowly carpenter. In all kinds of historical writings, often by non-Christians, for example, Flavius Josephus, and some of those we talked about, 40 different persons, but the emperor of Rome at the time, of this vast empire, Tiberius, the emperor of Rome, during Jesus' ministry, is only referenced in 10 the writings of 10 different people, whereas we said Jesus was 40. But moving back to David, that had been a big sticking point. People had said for years, where there's no reference, and then finally in, I believe, the 1990s. Now granted, we wouldn't expect too many archaeological records to survive. We're talking about 3,000 years ago, maybe 3,500 years ago. I mean, ancient history. We see a stone is uncovered from that time period that, secular scholars have written a lot of literature on. I would encourage you to go read, but references David, king of Israel. On that type of stuff, also, a lot of people will make a big to do about the fact that the Egyptian record seems to be kind of scarce. But the fact that Israel is mentioned at all in the Egyptian record is quite surprising, because such a long history. We're talking about ancient times. Such a long history. The historical record is huge. Egypt is got a very varied, winding history. That it has been a nation for a long time, and they were enslaved there for maybe around 400 years. So a small portion of its history. But during the reign of, I think it's Ramses II, and then maybe something from, what was her name? Imhotep, maybe? I can't remember. But there is a hieroglyph like story wall, and it actually using some of their hieroglyphs that represent sounds. It's clearly the pronunciation Israel. And then from Ramesses, there's another inscription. That's the only reference I know of to Israel at all. That's that sound. But there is a longer set of references. It's many, many times, and I can't remember the word it uses. It's like the Shavas of Yahweh, which they think that may mean slave or servant of Yahweh. So referencing, instead of Israel, it's referencing, these people we had. This is the God they worshipped. So Moses is pretty clear about him not wanting to get involved. We were talking about David. Wrote many books in the Old Testament, Psalms probably being his most famous work, but very clear about the faults David had. Comes right out and owns them. I committed adultery with what was her name? Bathsheba, maybe. And I sent her husband, I believe, Uriah, to the front lines of battle on purpose to have him killed. Basically, a murderer. Owns it, and that's the thing. They just so often own their faults. The frankness. We're used to people in society just constantly wearing a mask. But these people are saying, you shouldn't believe me for me at all. I'm just telling you what I've been told to do. And I am a fallible, fallen person. I don't want any kind of glory for myself. But let me just tell you what happened. It's incredible. The apostles in the New Testament talking about some of their bickering after Jesus was crucified, and then some of their doubts, and then not even recognizing him on Emmaus Road, and Peter denying him, and Paul saying he's the least of all. Just horrible, and cannot understand why God would call him into this ministry when he had for so long persecuted believers. You see that throughout both testaments. Just a candidness about the fallibility and the faults of the author. It truly is refreshing. And I say that to say, whether or not you believe this evidence points to whether or not you can believe it, and I hope one day after studying it, you do come to that belief. These are people that at least seem to be telling the truth. We often don't see this type of candor in any type of writing, even in other religious writing. People tend to be prideful and do not want to paint themselves in a bad light. They don't. So these seem to be people that have at least believed what they were writing. They seem to be people that were interested in telling the truth because they tell the truth about themselves and how weak and awful they were. So that doesn't seem like somebody who is trying to paint themselves in a certain way and win glory for themselves and become someone of fame and renown. No, that seems to be like someone who just wants to tell you the story they saw. And moving to that subject, that's something I want to talk about in the New Testament. People often will die for a belief. So that alone is not great proof, because often that belief is mistaken. Sometimes religious terrorists will commit suicide for a genuine belief. And I don't think many people doubt, if you're willing to die for it, that it is a genuine belief. But that's not solid evidence of the credibility of the original source, because it is solid evidence of your genuine belief, but you don't know the facts personally. You didn't see them. Someone told you this is how it is, and you genuinely believe that. The question with well, let's just start with Jesus. Knowing, so either he's a crazy person that genuinely believes that he is the Son of God, or he did in fact claim that, not because he was a crazy person, but because he is. And he said, here's how you can know. I'm going to rise 3 days later. And he makes some other prophetic claims, but that's the big one. He does some other miracles, heals people, and those types of things. But the big one is, I'm going to die, and I'm going to be in the earth. And on the third day after that, I will be resurrected. That's how you can know. So he makes that very bold claim. And knowing the penalty at the time to make such a blasphemous claim, if you're not in fact divine, would be a high probability you're going to be executed. I mean, that is a death penalty capital case all day long in first century Jerusalem. You cannot claim to be a part of Yahweh. You cannot claim to be a divine being. You can't even say like that name, much less claim to be part of him. So he knows he's going to be put to death for that belief. And we could explain that away as a mentally ill person. People claim to be God all the time. Go to any psych ward. I mean, I, in my profession, have interviewed people and talked with clients who I need to represent in IVC proceedings or involuntary commitment proceedings who are under some delusion that they are divine in some respect to varying degrees depending on the mental illness they suffer from. So that could be the case. Then we see at Jesus' arrest, the disciples scatter and they kind of chicken out. They're fearful about what's going to happen. But then something changes. And we see these not just in biblical writings, but even extra biblical writings, like that one we talked about from Josephus, where it said John claimed to have seen the resurrected Christ, and in fact, he had many followers from many nations and tongues who claimed to have seen him resurrected in Jerusalem. But I want to focus on the 12 who had spent years with this man. So they knew him well and claimed after his crucifixion that he was in fact resurrected. Now, you, like we talked about before, might be willing to die for a genuine held belief that you don't know personally. Like somebody's just told you, you're convinced yourself it's a genuine belief now. But if you know that it's false because you made it up, you're not usually willing to die for that. And 12 people, we might explain away one person being mentally ill, but 12 people are not likely to mass hallucinate the same thing. So these 12 all claim to have seen the resurrected Jesus. We see Peter, who denied during Jesus' trial and that day, denied Jesus after his arrest, that he even knew him 3 times. Yet later, he was kind of a scaredy cat when this happened, worried about the consequences. Oh no, what's happening? But then later has a complete turnaround, and this lack of courage, claims to have seen the resurrected Christ, and eventually is martyred and hung upside down. Pretty much all 12 came to terrible ends. Stephen being stoned. One of them, I can't remember now who, but being boiled alive. I mean, all of them, terrible, terrible executions. All became martyrs. And all of them, to the very end, insisted that they had seen the resurrected Christ, that they would not relent from that testimony, no matter what the consequences. You could execute them if you wanted. You could make them a martyr if you wanted, but they were not going to give it up. They were not going to deny it, that was the truth, and they would swear by it until their very last breath, and they all did. It's incredible. Incredible. We go from somebody who during the arrest and trial of Jesus goes from denying him 3 times in the same day to being crucified upside down, insisting that Jesus was the Messiah and that he saw the resurrected Christ after his crucifixion. He saw him crucified, saw he was dead, saw that he was in a tomb, and saw him resurrected later, and actually touched him. That this was, in fact, the Jesus of Nazareth that he knew. 12 people don't mass hallucinate and then go to their grave believing this as martyrs without a single one of them tripping up or changing the story. I mean, it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. You can't get 12 people to keep a straight story like that usually, even when they all did see it and know it. I mean, the conviction that they had seen the resurrected Jesus. It's hard to fathom another explanation for that that's logical and reasonable and makes sense, apart from the fact that they genuinely believed they had seen him. So that's really all I wanted to focus on in this one. I hope to continue making these, and I'll keep making them on whatever subject the Spirit leads with. So y'all be in prayer for me, especially y'all, those that are believers. Be in prayer for me. Be in prayer for this world, for people that may be watching that are unbelievers. And thank you for watching.